Good evening and welcome to night 5 of Chandelier. I'm so glad that you're here. Some of you have been to a few of these, some of you this may be your first time. This is an art salon that we started in January, and each month we do something completely different. We've had visual artists, we've had screenwriters showing the films that were about to be released, we had a live jazz combo. Last month we had canvases all strewn around the room and with music, and now we're going to get very down to the original word, right? We're going to talk about poetry, and Carol's going to treat us to language and beautiful images. And I want to tell you two things before I introduce you. Carol just made my day, and I'd never even met her, back in January, because she had seen a little promo. I don't know if it was either on Facebook or maybe because she follows the Masters in the Chapel. Some of you may know about the Masters in the Chapel concert series that we host here. And if you don't know about that, we're happy to tell you about it. It happens 4 times a year, and it's just world-class music, all for free. We've got some people here who I know I can come. So there's there's an email blast, and we had promoted Chandelier. And she had heard about that, and she got my email because she found out I was kind of the host and the curator and what have you. And she wrote the sweetest, most humble letter. And she said, I am Carol B. Davis. And then she went on to talk about her Fulbright scholarships and her T.S. Eliot Awards and send me some poems and samples. And she said, might I be considered for a future Chandelier? And I was like, within about 30 seconds, might you be free in May? She was booked, but she just made me feel so good, like that this was going to be a thing, and that people wanted to be a part of it, and they wanted to participate. And we didn't actually meet in person until March or April. And we went to Alana's to meet, as many of our pre-pros happen for this event. I'll meet with people, and we were sitting there having coffee and getting to know each other, making our plans for the evening. And as some of you know, the artist who we had here last month, Brunson, hangs out at Alana's a lot. He paints in the back, and he's now our artist in residence. He's there. And for some reason, out of nowhere, you and I were sitting there, and he came skateboarding by with a canvas about this big, and he went up and he gave it to Carol. He said, God told me to give this to you. And then he went moving on. And so with that, we got our second affirmation of you being a part of this wonderful new Chandelier family. So without further ado, I think what we're going to do tonight, sometimes we'll do a little interview first, and I'm going to let the artist and her art speak for itself. She's going to read for however long you think is a good amount of time.
Before your eyes start to glaze.
She's watching for eyes glazing, that's what she's watching for. And then we're going to do some Q&A. And I really want you to feel free, and she will make sure you know to feel free to ask anything, whether it's about art or poetry or her life or Russia or whatever you want to say. Okay, thank you and welcome. And Carol B. Davis, the mic is yours. Let's see if I can do this here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a different kind of mic, so I'm going to give it my best. I think I will hold it.
Do whatever you need to feel comfortable.
There, that's a bit easy, so I can look at both sides. So, since we have a little more time, instead of just reading, I'm going to talk about poetry a little bit and talk about where some of these poems come from, and then open it up to questions. And I will talk about Russia. I lived on and off in Russia for a long time. And I'm a pretty private person, but in Russia, people always, the first thing they said is, how come your husband isn't here and what's your salary? So I said, after that, you can ask me anything. Thinking about poetry, the way America doesn't have the tradition in the same way that poetry holds in many countries of speaking truth to power, the voice of conscience, like in Ireland and many countries in South and Latin America, Russia, absolutely. So very often people in the United States are really poetry averse. that if they're taught in high school that there's some kind of secret meaning to a poem, and if you don't get it, you're stupid. So by the time they graduate high school, many people, if they never see another poem again, it's too soon. So, especially often in Russia too, I felt like I was an ambassador for poetry. So, and the experience of a poem on the page, as many of you know, is really different from hearing it. And I like having both when that's possible. I've often said that if you take away one thing from listening to a poem, if one thing lingers in your mind, then it's a positive experience. It could be an image, it could be the sound of a poem, it could be, if it was a narrative poem, themes, and if something stays with you, then that was a positive experience. But poetry, like fiction and other art forms, there's something that it appeals to you personally, that we could all agree on what's well crafted, but what speaks to one person might not to another person. So that's enough of a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to mostly read from my last two books and then a few more recent poems, and then just open it up. People often think that all poetry is autobiographical too. Probably heard that. And but there's always the imagination. And when people say to me, "Is this real or is it from your imagination?" I always say yes. But the first poem I'm going to read is autobiographical. I was born in Berkeley, and I think most of you probably know who Admiral Nimitz was. He was in charge of the Pacific Fleet in World War II, and he was our neighbor. And it also has a freeway going into Berkeley. It's named after him, but before that, he was with the Pacific Fleet. So this is called Admiral Nimitz. Every day in summer, I'd cross the border. He'd nod, pick up the horseshoes, hand me one, triple the size of my palm, and say, "You first." We'd play away the afternoon. Few words punctuated the clank of horseshoe against stake until the fog rolled in and I'd retrace my steps home. I was 5 or 6, he white-haired, however old that meant. One evening, my father sat me down, spoke in the exaggerated tone adults adapt for children, asked if I knew who he was. Admiral Nimitz, of course, though I knew nothing of his command of the Pacific Fleet, and was less impressed than if he'd landed a horseshoe. He was a calm man, a useful attribute for sending young men to their deaths. The only time I saw him upset, raccoons had invaded from their hideouts in the hills, attacked the goldfish in his pond, leaving muddy footprints as they escaped. As far as I knew, this was his only defeat. So, like many artists, I always craved time when I could have time to do my work, and especially when I had 3 little kids at home, I was fortunate to get a lot of grants and would go to different parts of the United States to have some time to write. And so I'm going to read you a couple of poems from one of the fellowships. I was an artist in residence at a national park, and to me, Nebraska was very exotic. By that time, Russia was not exotic, but Nebraska was. I'd never been there before. And being in a new place, I didn't know the names of any of the birds or the flowers, so I was always bothering the Park Service people. So this is called Coneflower. All day watching the coneflowers, their many incarnations, the pale purple with its thin, drooping petals like an umbrella skeleton, abandoned in a doorway after a storm. Its cousin, the prairie coneflower, with a cap twice as long as wide. So boastful with that bullet head, brown-black like a Russian fur hat, and a stem 4 feet tall. Its yellow petals pulled downward, as if nature were playing a little joke, the way a beautiful woman will have one flaw, a dark mole that may or may not spoil everything. So this is another Nebraska poem. Both of those are one stanza and quite short. It's called Animal Time. I do better in animal time, a creeping dawn, slow ticking toward dusk. In the middle of the day on the Nebraska prairie, I'm unnerved by subdued sounds, as if listening through water. Even the high-pitched drone of the cicadas faint, the blackbirds half-heartedly singing. As newlyweds, my parents drove cross-country to Death Valley, last leg of their escape from New York. The thick soups of their immigrant mothers, generations of superstitions that squeezed them from all sides. They camped under stars that meant no harm. It was the silence that alerted them to danger. They climbed back into their tiny new car, locked its doors, and blinked their eyes until daylight. So we're going to move from Nebraska to Russia. So I had studied Russian literature in college. I went to the Soviet Union at age, 18 or 19 for a little while. And then I went on and studied Russian literature in college. And then a friend suggested I apply for Fulbright, and being Jewish, I was optimistic, 98% sure I wouldn't get it. And then I did. I applied as a poet. Most of Fulbrights are, or many of them are for scholars, but I wasn't teaching at that point. I applied as a poet. And so that began a 22-year, I think, over 20 years of going back and forth living in Russia. So the next poem is the title poem of this book. The book is called Because I Cannot Leave This Body. And I went in, I had a second Fulbright. My home was St. Petersburg in Russia, though my last 2 times there I was living in Siberia, and I'll talk about that. But I went, there was a Fulbright student, and the 2 of us signed up for a Russian tour. Going around to Pushkin's the family estate and various places where he had lived. He died in St. Petersburg, and he had lived in St. Petersburg. And Pushkin is the national hero in Russia. And so this poem comes from that. It was sort of a Pushkin pilgrimage. And at one point we stopped at a monastery, a Russian Orthodox monastery. And this is from it. It's called Because I cannot leave this body, I dream I am flying. The air splits, subdivides, splinters into layers of gray and warm lavender. Voices penetrate as if through fog in languages perhaps I never knew. No wonder men choose to be ghosts, switch the door from one wall to another. Women no more fragile, though a wandering hand to the cheek can betray. I return to the monastery in the Pushkin Hills, the chapel now silent, though I fear exposure. Candles bleed light and shadow onto cracked icons peering through silver. A young woman sloshes a bucket of water, her braid a metronome swinging on her spine. Monks with dark beards hurry past, as if God records how many hours of service. Because I cannot leave this body, I climb a circular staircase to the bell tower. So I'm ready for the slide to... So, some of my poetry, as you can tell, is narrative, and one of the things that people are sometimes curious about is how do you decide how to place a poem on a page? And we fiddle around with it a lot. And this is a poem which is partially narrative, but partially not. And so I wanted it to be spaced out on the page. There's very little punctuation in it, and I use spacing in it. So I thought you could have the experience of looking at the poem as well as hearing it. It has some biblical references which you may see. Yom Kippur is the most serious holiday in the Jewish calendar, and they say that there are 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur when the book of life is open and it's decided who will live and who will die. So I have a reference to that, and I am a great fan of Rachmaninoff's sacred music, so that's in the poem. On the eve of Yom Kippur, I listen to the Rachmaninoff Vespers. Is every portal to heaven equal? These 10 days when the book of life lies open before the pages flutter shut. The reeds are on both sides of the river, but the choice is not always ours to make, to cross or not, to remain where we are or chance fleeing. An uneasy marriage of expectation and guilt, so many temptations to succumb to. Once in Blvd, I stumbled into a funeral service. All I intended was to gaze at the cathedral's stained glass windows. The Orthodox priest swung the censer toward the congregation. Though I was standing in the back, he caught my eye and knew I did not belong. Now, on the eve of this Jewish holiday, I listen to the Rachmaninoff Vespers, and when I look up, the windows have blurred into waves of blue and gold, darkened by centuries of incense. So, we can talk about this now or later if anyone has any questions about it. Yeah.
Can you tell us about the though at the end of the line?
Well, I wanted, it was purposeful. I wanted a break, and that the though would sort of stand alone, even though when you read it sort of naturally, though I was standing in the back, but I wanted to show the oddness of this position, because this did come from, I went into a church. I was, Blvd is a beautiful ancient city between St. Petersburg and Moscow, and I went there quite a few times and gave talks at university, and I happened to go into the cathedral because I wanted to see it, and there was a funeral going on, and I sort of, deer in the headlights, froze, like I didn't belong, and I didn't want to make a fuss and leave, and that's how that came about. So, okay, yeah.
I was curious, I noticed that, maybe not all the lines, but a lot of the lines are ends, what we would call end stop lines, which means they sort of, there's a thought or a phrase or a sort of a sentence that ends at the end of the line. So there's not that effect of a line that's broken somewhere in an unorthodox place, an unexpected place. And I wonder, could there be a relationship between the way that you place the lines on the page in relation to the fact that most of the lines, that line breaks are not an important part of what you're doing here. It's
Well,
almost as
I
if
wanted
you're
a kind of
achieving
simplicity, so I didn't put periods, even though there are lots of these sentences. So, and I used more space in between than I normally did. So it was one of those, so I wanted to, because it's mostly not narrative, or at least the first part, I wanted these breaks, but that,
And maybe that's doing something that line breaks might do in another,
yeah.
in a different way.
Yeah. So we fiddle around a lot with that until it feels right on the page. Yeah. Okay.
Sarah,
Yeah.
do you know anything about, Rachmaninoff's Vespers? I mean, was there a particular message from
Well, and then it's sacred music, and I just happen to love it. And I was pretty aware of the irony of listening to Vespers right before I was going to go to services the next day. But it was just, it's very mystical, I guess. And I find Russian Orthodox church music, I really love it actually, and his modern take on it is really beautiful. So that's one. And titles are really hard and interesting too. Like sometimes you can put information in the title that isn't anywhere else. And so I did that here. Titles can come from a line in a poem or not be related at all. So, okay. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just thinking about this now. I mean, I've obviously been in temples before for different activities in church temples, and there's always art and certain kinds of art. And I can't remember. Is stained glass, is that a part of the
It depends what, the Orthodox don't have it, but more of the other branches often do have. And often, it can be either abstract or sometimes, biblical stories. Yeah. But Russian Orthodox cathedrals do have churches. Okay. So I'm gonna go to, you can take this down, I think. Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, my last two trips to Russia, I spent the first year I was there with my kids, but other than that whole year, there were like segments, like 6 months, 5 months, different time periods, but January is a time when I could take off from teaching without losing a whole semester of classes. So I did spend a lot of Januaries in Russia. And so I'll just say, yes, I went to Siberia twice in January voluntarily. Somebody always makes a joke about winter in Siberia. And yeah, it was cold, but mostly winter's very long there. So this book, and Johanna Drucker painted the cover. She's here, so very sweetly. So this book has a variety of themes, but it is largely from, there's a whole lot of poems about Siberia. I was living twice in a city near the Mongolian border. It's called Ulan-Ude. It's in Buryatia, the republic. It's an ethnic minority region where they practice Buddhism and shamanism. So it was a really interesting, there are also Russians there, but the majority of people. So it's a really interesting area. And so I'm going to read some poems from that time period. But first, now that I've introduced that, I'm going to start with a poem that's not from there. So one of my artist residency was up on Bainbridge Island in Washington. There's a wonderful nature reserve called Blvd. It's a private nature reserve, and I spent an August there. And while I was there, there were terrible fires on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and we could smell smoke sometimes, and there was some ash, so it that's in this poem. And this poem too, I struggled, it is not narrative, and I wanted to separate the sections but without numbering them. So I put little glyphs there. So, and there is no punctuation in this poem. But I'll pause between the different sections. It's called The Air is Full. The air is full of particles, ash from the smoke of fires to the north. Last night, the sky an ungodly color, shifting orange to yellow and back. A kind of stillness that in California means earthquake, whether it arrives or not. In the dream, a man stood up. Nothing unordinary about him, except for the half circle of people. I hesitate to call them disciples. He raised his hand. Sparks flew. I have never succumbed to full acceptance, even as I envy those who can follow without questioning. The Amish boy in Shipshewana who rejects the tractor in favor of plow horses in the field. The Hasidic woman who handed over her son to be circumcised, not hiding in the bedroom as I did. It is true that God was put on trial at Auschwitz. He did not fare well. I was taught how to question, not how to believe. We are told there were 2 sets of tablets, one destroyed, one saved, fire and cloud. We are always carving a new golden calf, searching for solace to convince ourselves we chose right. I scratch out letters from branches, the alphabet in the 3 languages I pretend to know, compare their shapes, assess their durability. The flakes thicken, carpeting the meadow, coating prairie flax and cornflower. I look upward, but no prayer is answered. And I inadvertently lied. There is a little punctuation here.
What was that one called, Carol?
It's called The Air is Full. And Shipshewana is an Amish community. I was teaching in Michigan for a little while and very eagerly went to visit the Amish community, and that's the reference to Shipshewana and Amish. So this is a poem that came from my living in St. Petersburg. And it's called White Night. So those of some of you might know, there's in St. Petersburg, it's very far north. It's on the same latitude as Fairbanks, Alaska. So in the winter, my kids went to school in the dark. It was 9 o'clock and still dark. And by 3 o'clock when they came home, it was dark again. So it was very short. But in summer, it is light almost the whole night. It sort of fades a little around 2, and then by 4, it's bright again. And I remember with my youngest having a dragged, whatever the expression is, drag out fight with her because it was 10 o'clock at night, and I suggested maybe she should go to bed, and she thought it was noon. And then I was pulling a fast one on her. So this poem references that, and it's called White Nights. Midnight could be noon, people strolling on the embankment, unable or unwilling to tell the difference. Drunken song and linked arms. It is January I love, when night tucks into the corners of the city with piles of snow pushed against the curb. The blinking lights of the Blvd cafe, the samovar's breath puffing against the front window. Walking back from the metro, blackness presses against the Soviet bloc apartments until they are indistinguishable. Darkness untamed even in this major metropolis. The day I took the wrong minibus ended far from this city, the fear of never getting back, picturing my wool coat curled beneath the birches, a small animal. Not that the bus left me so far out, but alone on a road, past a half-frozen lake, a shabby church with a midnight cupola, no English in sight. I crossed the road, stamped my feet to keep from numbing, a prayer to keep my tongue from losing its agility. A man pulled a sled with firewood on a path that was no path. I waited. So finally we are going to Siberia here. And so Russia, as many of you know, is a huge country. So I flew from, I had been in Berlin on a grant and went back to St. Petersburg to visit friends. And I had evaluated, I sometimes evaluated Fulbright applications for Russian scholars trying to come to the US, and back when they could. And I evaluated and recommended this applicant. She didn't get the Fulbright, but I happened to mention to her that I was going to be in St. Petersburg. And it's a little like being in New York and somebody saying, well, just come to London. You know, it's not like it's 2 hours driving. So I mentioned I was going to be in St. Petersburg, and she wrote back and said, if I can get my university paid for you to come from Moscow, will you come and teach? And I, of course, said yes. I didn't know this woman, never met this woman, and it all worked out beautifully, and I went back the next year. So that is in here. The Tanya is sort of a sacred book in the Hasidic ultra-Orthodox community, and that's mentioned in the poem. And then the last thing, I think a couple more things. Blvd Rebbe was the head rabbi of the Lubavitch Hasidic movement, and that's in here. There's the name of a Russian plane that you know, don't need. Buryat is the ethnic group in the area where I was living. Okay, that's enough. It's called On Flying to Siberia for the First Time. It's true, I was nervous. It didn't help that my local travel agent instructed me to buy the tickets in the US, just in case. Not exactly a believer, I hedged my bets, tucked a copy of a sacred book, the Tanya, in my carry-on. The irony of a Lubavitcher Rebbe exiled to Siberia a century before. Packed the travel icon a friend gave me on my last trip to Russia. I tried to block memory of a news video, a flight crew scraping ice off the wings of a Tupolev 154 on a Siberian runway, as routine as de-icing the windshield of a car parked in an upstate driveway. Shuffling in a long line at gate 34, Sheremetyevo Airport, Siberia Air, flight 115, Moscow to Ulan-Ude, I eyed the other passengers. I was the only American on board. Squeezed near the last row between two thick Buryat men, I gripped the armrests as if they were the handlebars of a Harley, the task of revving the engine for takeoff, mine alone. An hour in, vast snowfields unfurled, pockmarked by tiny villages spouting chimney smoke. No seat vacant, the hum of conversation quieted, the sky darkening, another 5 hours to go. A mumble of Hebrew rose from my lips for a safe flight and landing, that I be met on the other end, that I would see my family again. So I just have a few more poems. This is another Siberia poem. One of the things in Siberia is that many of the people believe, in Russia too, of house spirits. And they put up, like in Scandinavia, where you hang little, little straw figures, they often do. And I went to visit Irkutsk, which is a bigger city in Siberia, my last time there, and was staying with friends of a colleague. And so in Siberia, I watch my host. Ilya sits at the kitchen table, open bottle of beer before him, pours half a glass, dips a finger in, taps it on the tabletop. For the house spirits, Marina explains, to appease or nourish, I am not sure, nor what role the ancestors play. In the Irkutsk Historical Museum, a 19th century shaman's robe hangs with strips of metal and a few keys to summon the spirits for protection or to banish evil ones. I think of our own Passovers, finger dipping in the wine and tapping. Blood, vermin, locusts, the power, the fear. So before your eyes start glazing, I just have 3 more poems, and they're more recent poems. Hopefully we'll be in another book. Oh dear. Wait. Oh, there it is. Phew. So my husband had a fairly unusual form of Alzheimer's, and naturally I wrote about it, and he has passed away. But so I have a whole series of poems that reference that, and this one is called Seabirds. Here on a spit of land at the edge of the country, where in college friends and I would cross the border for dinner, be waved through customs, zip back to the dorms before midnight, a biologist explains the evolution of seabirds. The strutters, the pickers, how one beak narrowing could extract crustaceans buried in the sand, while another's beak broadening into a pouch scoops fish out of the waves. My husband, always with an opinion, is retreating, beginning to wander in a labyrinth I cannot follow. His path, not predictable as the tide pulsing in and out, is punctuated by long silences 1 minute, outbursts of anger the next. The doctors fluctuate between a show of certainty, suggesting medications not to cure, but to slow, and wavering, demonstrating too clearly what they cannot predict. I can't say I have the needed patience, spend too much time dreaming of escape, longing even for the sub-zero temperatures of Siberia. Just now, the biologist points out a black oyster catcher on an outcrop of rock, legs covered in what looks like flesh stockings, red beak, yellow eye, rimmed red. It's rat-a-tat-tat, insistent. He stabs the air, vigilant over the shoreline, he claims. So I went to mostly college near the Canadian border in Washington State and graduate school in Seattle, so there's a lot of time there. So I'm going to end with a really recent poem, and change. With the sky still dark, only the murmur of house finches on the scrawny branches of the white rose bush at my doorstep, and the wild parrots that usually streak from one street to the next, noisy as congregants before the start of prayers, nowhere to be seen. Out on my morning run in what yesterday was the pink spread of sunrise, today little more than shadows under street lamps still illuminated, and I, after a recent fall, no longer trust my legs to read the braille of bumps and cracks where sidewalks erupt from an explosion of roots. My body knows the route by heart, but the solace of this solitary hour has vanished. Each curb a danger. Give me back the wavering gray of dawn. Let the day begin again at 6. So hopefully your eyes aren't glazed over yet, and I'm open for any questions or.
See what
Yeah.
I'm there?
So, when was the last time you were in Russia?
So I was there in 2018, and I was supposed to have another Fulbright in a different part of Siberia in 2020, and we all remember what happened in 2020. So I postponed twice because of COVID, because their rates were really high, higher than here, and I have asthma. It wasn't a good idea to go. And then the war broke out, and Fulbright got closed. You know, the whole program is closed in Russia. So I still hear from friends, but they're not saying anything, and I'm not saying anything. You know, we chit-chat about what we're reading or our kids.
And then one quick one, do you remember your first time you got involved with poetry? You thought, oh, you know, you
Yeah.
were you?
Well, I mean, I grew up in an academic family, but nobody was in literature. I mean, we read a lot, but, and this sounds, I know it sounds pretty corny. I was a dancer, and actually I was gonna read one more poem, maybe I still can, about dance. I was a dancer, so I was always in the arts, but it was when I left graduate school, I started writing, and I just knew that was what I was supposed to do, which does sound really corny, but it's very true. So you up for one last poem?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I forgot this one. So I've been working on, I think I'm done, but I keep saying that, a series of poems about having been a dancer. And I was studied the Martha Graham technique, and I was telling someone I actually was kicked out of class by Martha Graham herself. Great honor. And but this poem references Paul Taylor, and there's a Paul Taylor piece called Esplanade that is to Bach, and it's just beautiful. And this poem explores that. It's called On Revisiting Paul Taylor. Only in dreams can I suspend in a jump the way I did as a dancer. Though the music continued and my fellow company members kept the beat, I lagged behind. At an age when suspension mid-air is impossible, I fight for it, surprised when I thud on the floor. In Esplanade, the dancers walk heel-toe, reverse direction, skip, join hands, and circle in a folk dance. When one leaps into another's arms, she is always caught. As she hopscotches over bodies lying in diagonal formation, she never lands on prone torsos. What is it like to be protected by a confidence that shields one from harm while embracing risk, that provides faith in a safe outcome and optimism not viewed with suspicion? Bach's Esplanade whisks the dancers along, the music lifting them until gravity almost loses its grip and in each performance, the dancers return to earth, the sweep of their arms a promise of a welcome future. So, any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all this beautiful poetry. I was just wondering if there were any poet who inspired you along the way?
Oh, sure. I mean, I read lots of poetry and yeah.
Is there anyone when you were young that you particularly read, or
Well,
anybody recently?
more as an adult. Bridget Jean Kelly is one of my, but I'm a pretty fickle reader. I love lots of, especially with novels. My new favorite novel is the last one I read that I liked, you know. So, but yeah, but I read a lot of poetry, and sound and music is so important in poetry. Yeah.
I was wondering, but whom to love, to trust and treasure, who won't betray us in the end, and who will be kind enough to measure our words and deed as we intend. For those of us, most of us in the US and other European countries know preciously little about Russian literature. What is a gentle approach to learn about Pushkin and other giants of Russian
Well,
literature?
they really emphasize it in school. And can I give you an anecdote that was really fun? So one time I was living in St. Petersburg, and right before I was leaving to come back to the US, I went out with some of my students to a little cafe, sort of a treat, and Father Frost, who's and the Snow Maiden came waltzing in sort of Las Vegas glittery gowns. It was right around Christmas, and said, "I'll give a present to anyone who can recite Pushkin." And this my students were going up, and you know, hiding, and this 4-year-old got up and by heart recited Pushkin. So there's just this, it's a wonderful tradition, and we used to have it here of memorizing poetry, which really is an ear training. It's great, but we don't do it here anymore. Yeah. So that sort of answers it. But they still read the classics very much, and know it.
Do you know when a poem is done? Do you have advice or
Well,
knowing when?
I could be flippant and say when I get sick of it, but that's not a fair answer. It really varies, and there are poems that I fiddle with forever, or I'll put aside for a long time and come back to it. Hopefully, there is a time when I finally feel like it's finished, for better or for worse. Yeah, that's a hard one. Please.
What actually got you involved in the Russian language, or even an interest in Russia as
I fell in love with Russian literature. I mean, I had grandparents from Russia and Ukraine, but once they came to the US, they didn't speak it and didn't talk about it. So I didn't grow up with it, but I had fallen in love with Russian literature. And then, of course, I had to study Russian. I was a bad language student. I was always cheating and reading novels instead of studying my case endings. But eventually I learned Russian. But by the time I went to live in Russia on Fulbright, it had been 15 years from graduate school to going to move there, so I was rusty. I did manage to teach one of my classes in Russian because the students were very kind and helpful. But I was pretty, I could sort of talk about literature, but I'm very mathematically challenged. So how many kilos of apples was I bringing home? And there was all sorts of regular vocabulary I didn't know. Not to mention my kids would come home from school and teach me the bad words.
So actually your kids were in Russia, living with you in Russia?
For the first year I was there, but they went to the international school because I thought my two oldest needed to stay grade level. They studied Russian and French in school, but the instruction was in English. But my second time in Russia, I came back to the US, had a terrible time readjusting, went back to Russia, and just my youngest came with me and went to a Russian speaking school. And it was just disgusting. Within 3 months, she was completely fluent. You know, I've been laboring for years and years, but she was only 5 or 6 at the time, so we'll pick it up really quickly. Yeah, so it makes a whole lot more sense to learn a language as a child, but I didn't. I mean, I studied French in school, and I went to Hebrew school.
Do we have any other questions?
Remember, you could ask me anything. Don't you want to know what my salary was?
Do you have a favorite poem that you've written?
No. I mean, there are poems, like I like that poem a lot, but no. But my salary at the Jewish University was $200 a month, and that didn't go very far. But just one more comment, the whole question about what's your salary, it didn't make sense to answer, because if you're not paying for healthcare and you're not paying for housing, you can live on a whole lot less than here. Those are our two of our major expenses. So my salary here, or my pay, I'm sorry, is pitiful, but there it would have sounded pretty good. So you can't make those kinds of comparisons, just don't make sense. Well, thank you so
If
much.
anyone has any more questions, I'm not trying to cut her off, I just want to see, any more?
I have a comment for you. Your poetry is wonderful. So, but I introduced you to another type, a short one. It's called Fleas.
No.
Adam Hadam.
Oh, thank you, Chuck. That's perfect. To just sit and receive and be in the hands of such a pro, you know, and just be bathed in language. And it was just a great gift. So thank you guys for being here. For those who are here for the first time, a few little notes. If we do this every month. If you want to know who's coming next, you can follow me on Instagram here at FaithInPics or First Lutheran Venice, and we will announce those things. It's usually the 3rd Saturday of the month. We start at 6:30. We have the artist presentation, then we have refreshments. Look, we have all of our wonderful little helpers that are getting refreshments. We have charcuterie and Prosecco over there. And then we like to have Prosecco at all the tables with the sweets over here. But we, part of what we love about this and why I first decided to name it Chandelier, and which, by the way, the photos on the invite were taken by a Russian woman who lives here. Her husband is here, Oleg, but she couldn't make it because what did she do? She overdid today, right? She's napping. We'll get more details on that later. But the reason why I wanted to call it Chandelier as opposed to some art name is because chandeliers are what sit over the table when we gather together for food, for exchange of ideas, for a feeling of connection as community, and more than even just the arts that we share. I wanted us to remember the feeling of being in this room. And we all live here in Venice or in Mar Vista. And many of us, if we don't create art, we appreciate art. And so as much as hearing from Carol is such a great gift, I hope too that you will stay and enjoy a little refreshment and make a new friend. And if you enjoyed being here tonight, we hope you'll come again. Thank you so much for being here. Good night. I'll be over here. Oh, thank you. Sorry, my announcement. Kira brought books, and my friend Anna, who's come all the way from Minnesota just to sell them. So really,